In the quaint fog-draped town of Eldermoor, nestled between rolling hills and ancient oak groves, a peculiar tale unfolded that would become the stuff of local legend. It began on a crisp autumn evening when the leaves glowed amber under the harvest moon and the air carried the faint scent of wood smoke in anticipation. My brother Elias, a jovial man with a penchant for storytelling and a knack for noticing the smallest details, received an invitation to an engagement party. The invitation, embossed with silver filigree and sealed with wax, bore the names of Julian Haverford and Celeste Montague, a couple whose love story had captivated the town. Elias arrived at the Haverford estate, a sprawling manor with ivy-clad walls and windows that flickered with candlelight. The party was a spectacle of opulence. Crystal chandeliers cast prisms across the ballroom, musicians played lilting waltzes, and guests in tailored suits and flowing gowns whispered about the couple's fairy tale romance. Julian, a dashing architect with a warm smile and eyes that sparkled with ambition, stood beside Celeste, a painter whose ethereal beauty and quiet grace seemed to draw light into any room. Her laughter was like wind chimes, soft and melodic, and her presence grounded Julian's restless energy. Elias, ever the observer, noted how their hands intertwined naturally, how their glances spoke of shared secrets and unspoken promises. The night was perfect. Nothing hinted at the storm that would soon upend their story. As the months passed, Eldermoor buzzed with preparations for the wedding. The town square was adorned with garlands of white roses, and the local bakery churned out tiered cakes adorned with sugared violets. Elias, invited to the wedding as a courtesy for his role as a local historian, looked forward to documenting the event in his journal, a habit he'd kept since childhood. The wedding was set for a Sunday in early spring, when the hills would be blanketed in wildflowers and the air would hum with the promise of renewal. The invitation, identical in design to the engagement parties, arrived in Elias's mailbox, confirming the date, time, and venue. The historic St. Elowin's Chapel, a stone sanctuary perched on a cliff overlooking the sea. On the morning of the wedding, Elias donned his finest suit, a deep charcoal with a lavender pocket square, and made his way to the chapel. The sky was a brilliant cerulean, streaked with wisps of clouds, and the ocean below roared softly, as if whispering blessings for the day. Guests milled about the chapel's rose garden, their voices a cheerful hum. Elias greeted familiar faces. Mrs. Hawthorne, the town's florist, who'd woven the bride's bouquet, Mr. Pembroke, the tailor who'd crafted Julian's suit, and young Lila, the baker's apprentice, who'd helped ice the cake. Everything seemed as it should be, a picture of small-town harmony. But as Elias stepped into the chapel, a strange sensation prickled at the back of his neck. The pews were filled, the altar adorned with lilies and candlelight, and Julian stood at the front, resplendent in his dove-gray tuxedo. His expression, however, was not one of nervous excitement, but of quiet resolve, as if he were steeling himself for an ordeal rather than a celebration. The organ began its solemn prelude, and all eyes turned to the chapel's entrance, awaiting the bride. The doors swung open, and a woman glided down the aisle, her veil shimmering like moonlight on water. Her gown was a cascade of silk and lace, and she carried herself with a regal poise that silenced the room. But Elias's breath caught in his throat. This was not Celeste. The woman's features were sharper, her eyes a striking emerald rather than Celeste's soft hazel. Her hair, visible beneath the veil, was a cascade of raven curls, not the golden waves that had framed Celeste's face. Whispers rippled through the congregation, but no one dared speak aloud. The ceremony proceeded, vows were exchanged, and Julian kissed the stranger with a tenderness that seemed both genuine and haunted. The new bride, introduced as Isadora Vane, smiled warmly at the guests, but her eyes held a depth that Elias couldn't decipher. Sorrow, perhaps, or a secret too heavy to share. After the ceremony, Elias lingered at the reception, held in the Haverford Estate's Grand Conservatory. The tables were laden with roasted pheasant, delicate pastries, and flutes of champagne, but the atmosphere was tinged with unease. Guests spoke in hushed tones, their curiosity warring with their manners. Elias approached Julian, hoping for clarity, but the groom's response was cryptic. "Life has a way of rewriting our plans," he said, his voice low. "Isadora is my future now." When Elias pressed for details about Celeste, Julian's face darkened. "She's gone, Elias. That's all you need to know." Determined to unravel the mystery, Elias began piecing together fragments of gossip and observation. He learned from Mrs. Hawthorne that Celeste had vanished 2 weeks before the wedding, leaving behind her studio, her paintings, and a note that read only, "Forgive me." No one had seen her since. Mr. Pembroke mentioned that Julian had ordered a second gown, identical to Celeste's, just 10 days prior, claiming it was a surprise. Lila, the baker's apprentice, whispered that Isadora had arrived in Eldermoor a week before the wedding, staying at the manor and rarely venturing out. She'd overheard Isadora speaking to Julian late one night, her voice trembling with words like duty and sacrifice. Elias's inquiries led him to the town's archives, where he uncovered a curious connection. Isadora Vane hailed from a reclusive family in the neighboring county, known for their wealth and eccentricities. Decades ago, a Vane ancestor had been betrothed to a Haverford, only for the engagement to dissolve under mysterious circumstances. Rumors of debts, promises, or even curses swirled around the families, though nothing was substantiated. Elias wondered if Julian's marriage to Isadora was less about love and more about obligation, a settling of old scores or a fulfillment of some hidden pact. Months later, Elias encountered Isadora at the market, her emerald eyes softer now, though still guarded. She spoke kindly, revealing little but hinting at a past that had bound her to Julian long before Celeste entered his life. "Sometimes," she said, "we choose our paths, and sometimes they're chosen for us." Elias never saw Celeste again, though her paintings remained in the manor, their colors fading like memories. Julian and Isadora built a life together, their bond growing into something resembling love, but Eldermoor never forgot the wedding that defied explanation. The tale of the swapped bride became a story told by firelight, embellished with each retelling. Some said Celeste had fled to pursue her art in a distant city, others that she'd been spirited away by forces unknown. Elias, ever the historian, recorded it all in his journal, leaving the truth to linger in the spaces between words, as elusive as the fog that cloaked Eldermoor's hills. In the months following the enigmatic wedding in Eldermoor, the town settled into an uneasy rhythm, as if the air itself held its breath, waiting for the next chapter of the Haverford mystery to unfold. Elias, my brother, could not shake the image of Isadora Vane gliding down the aisle in place of Celeste Montague, her emerald eyes catching the candlelight like a storm-tossed sea. The absence of explanation gnawed at him, and his historian's instinct drove him deeper into the shadows of the town's past, determined to uncover the truth behind the swapped bride. Winter descended on Eldermoor, blanketing the hills in snow and cloaking the Haverford estate in an almost spectral silence. Elias continued his quiet investigation, visiting the town's archives by day and eavesdropping on hushed conversations at the local tavern by night. The townsfolk, though reluctant to speak openly, shared fragments of lore that hinted at a tangled history between the Haverfords and the Vanes. One elderly librarian, Miss Agnes, her hands trembling as she turned the pages of a dusty ledger, whispered of a decades-old scandal, a broken betrothal between a Haverford heir and a Vane daughter, followed by whispers of a debt unpaid or a promise unkept. "Some say it was more than money," Agnes murmured, her eyes darting to the archive's darkened corners. "Some say it was a matter of blood." Elias's journal filled with notes, cryptic references to a covenant between the families, mentions of a Vane ancestor who vanished under mysterious circumstances, and rumors of a secluded Vane manor in the neighboring county, where strange lights flickered in the windows at midnight. He learned that Isadora, the new bride, had arrived in Eldermoor mere days before the wedding, her presence unannounced until she appeared at Julian's side. Yet no one could recall seeing her arrive by carriage or train, as if she'd materialized from the mist itself. One stormy evening, Elias braved the icy roads to visit the Haverford estate, hoping to speak with Julian. The manor loomed against the bruised sky, its windows glowing faintly through the blizzard. Isadora answered the door, her raven hair loose and her expression unreadable. "Julian's away," she said, her voice smooth but edged with caution. "Business in the city." Elias, undeterred, asked about Celeste, framing his question as concern for an old friend. Isadora's smile faltered, and for a moment her eyes seemed to shimmer with something like regret. "Celeste made her choice," she said softly. "She's free now. In a way I'll never be." Before Elias could press further, she closed the door, leaving him in the howling wind. The encounter only deepened Elias's resolve. He tracked down Celeste's former studio, a small attic space above the town's apothecary, where her paintings still hung, covered in dust. The canvases depicted dreamlike landscapes, misty cliffs, moonlit seas, and figures that seemed to dissolve into shadow. One painting, half finished, showed a woman in a wedding gown, her face obscured by a veil that seemed to writhe like smoke. Elias felt a chill, wondering if Celeste had foreseen her own absence. He pocketed a sketch he found crumpled on the floor, a hurried drawing of a woman with Isadora's sharp features, her eyes wide with fear, captioned in Celeste's handwriting, "She watches." Elias's search led him to the Vane estate, a crumbling manor hidden deep in the woods of the neighboring county. The locals avoided it, claiming the grounds were cursed, but Elias, armed with a lantern and his notebook, ventured inside. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the walls were lined with portraits of stern-faced Vanes, their eyes seeming to follow him. In a locked study, he found a journal belonging to Isadora's great-aunt, Elias Vane, dated 50 years prior. The entries spoke of a pact between the families, forged to settle a debt of life for life. Elias wrote of a ritual, a binding of fates where one family's happiness was sacrificed for the other's survival. The final entry was scrawled in a frantic hand. "They took her. They always take one of us." As Elias pieced together the puzzle, he began to suspect that Isadora's marriage to Julian was no mere substitution, but part of a cycle, a repayment of an ancient obligation. He wondered if Celeste had uncovered the truth and fled to escape it, or if something darker had befallen her. His suspicions were fueled by a chance encounter with Lila, the baker's apprentice, who confessed to seeing Celeste's silhouette near the cliffs the night before she vanished, standing as if in a trance, staring out to sea. Elias confronted Julian upon his return to Eldermoor, meeting him at the tavern under the guise of a friendly drink. Julian's face was haggard, his once vibrant eyes dulled by a weight he wouldn't name. "You're digging too deep, Elias," he warned, his voice low. "Some truths are better left buried." When Elias mentioned the vain journal, Julian's hand trembled, spilling his drink. "Isadora didn't choose this any more than I did," he said. "We're bound by something older than us, stronger than us. Let it go." But Elias couldn't let it go. He began to notice strange occurrences. His journal pages rearranged in the night, whispers in the dark that echoed Celeste's voice, and fleeting glimpses of a veiled figure in the fog. One night, as he pored over his notes by candlelight, a knock came at his door. It was Isadora, her face pale and her hands clutching a letter sealed with the vain crest. "You want the truth?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Read this, but know that once you do, you're part of it." She vanished into the night before he could respond. The letter, written in an elegant but trembling script, was from Celeste. It spoke of a discovery in the Vane archives, a ritual that demanded a bride from each generation to maintain a fragile balance between the families. Celeste had refused to be the sacrifice, choosing to flee, but warned that the pact would claim another in her place. "Isadora is not what she seems," the letter read. "She is both victim and keeper of the debt. Be careful, Elias. They see you now." As Elias finished reading, the candle flickered out and the room filled with a cold, unnatural silence. He felt a presence behind him, and in the reflection of his window, he saw a figure, veiled, motionless, its eyes glowing faintly. The story of Eldermoor's swapped bride was far from over, and Elias realized with a sinking dread that he was no longer just its chronicler, but a player in its unfolding tragedy. The chill in Elias's cottage lingered long after the candle flickered out, and the veiled figure in the window's reflection vanished as if swallowed by the night. His heart pounded, the letter from Celeste trembling in his hands. Her words echoed in his mind. "They see you now." Who or what were they? The weight of the mystery pressed against him, as heavy as the fog that blanketed Eldermoor. Elias knew he could no longer remain a passive observer. The story had ensnared him, and retreat was no longer an option. The next morning, under a sky bruised with storm clouds, Elias resolved to follow the trail left by Celeste's letter. He packed his journal, a map of the county, and a small dagger he'd inherited from his father, a relic from a time when Eldermoor's hills were wilder and its secrets sharper. His destination was the Vane estate, where the answers, if they existed, lay hidden in the shadows of its decaying halls. The townsfolk, sensing his purpose, offered warnings cloaked in kindness. Mrs. Hawthorne pressed a sprig of rosemary into his hand, muttering, "For protection." Mr. Pembroke, the tailor, shook his head and said, "Some doors, once opened, don't close." But Elias, driven by a mix of curiosity and dread, pressed on. The journey to the Vane Manor was treacherous, the forest path slick with frost and tangled with roots that seemed to shift underfoot. As he approached, the manor loomed like a forgotten sentinel, its spires piercing the mist. The iron gates creaked open at his touch, as if expecting him. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint scent of lavender, a perfume that stirred a memory of Celeste's engagement party. Elias's lantern cast long shadows, and the portraits on the walls seemed to watch him with renewed intensity, their painted eyes glinting with secrets. He returned to the study where he'd found Elwyn Vane's journal, hoping to uncover more. The room was untouched, the journal still open to its final, frantic entry. But as Elias searched the shelves, he discovered a hidden compartment behind a portrait of a stern Vane matriarch. Inside was a leather-bound tome, its pages brittle and yellowed, inscribed with symbols that seemed to pulse faintly in the lantern's glow. The text, written in an archaic script, detailed the covenant of the twin veils, a ritual binding the Haverfords and Vanes across generations. It spoke of a debt incurred centuries ago, when a Haverford ancestor had betrayed a Vane bride, condemning her to a fate worse than death. To restore balance, the families were bound to offer a bride in each generation, one to wed, one to vanish, their fates intertwined with a force the text called the Watchers. Elias's blood ran cold as he read of the Watchers, entities described as neither living nor dead, guardians of the pact who ensured its fulfillment. The tome warned that those who defied the covenant would face their wrath, and those who sought to unravel it would become their prey. A passage underlined in faded ink read, "The chosen bride bears the veil of sacrifice, but the one who flees carries the shadow of guilt. Both are bound, and none escape." Elias realized that Celeste's flight had not freed her, but had shifted the burden to Isadora, and perhaps to him. As he closed the tome, a low hum filled the room, like the drone of distant bees. The air grew heavy, and the lantern flickered. From the corner of his eye, he saw movement, a figure in a veiled gown, gliding silently across the study. He called out, "Celeste?" But the figure vanished through the wall. Heart racing, Elias followed, finding a hidden staircase behind a tapestry. It descended into a cavern beneath the manor, its walls carved with the same symbols from the tome. At the center stood a stone altar, stained with dark, unidentifiable marks, and above it hung a tattered veil, swaying as if stirred by an unseen breeze. On the altar lay a locket, its surface engraved with the initials CM, Celeste Montague. Inside was a miniature portrait of her hazel eyes bright but haunted. A note scrawled in her hand was tucked beneath. "I tried to break the cycle, but they found me. If you read this, Elias, run." The hum grew louder, and the veil above the altar began to writhe, its fabric twisting into shapes that resembled faces, agonized, eyeless, and screaming. Elias stumbled back, the dagger slipping from his hand, and fled the cavern, the echoes of his own footsteps chasing him up the stairs. Back in Eldermoor, Elias barricaded himself in his cottage, the tome and locket hidden under a floorboard. Sleep eluded him. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind felt like the Watchers closing in. He pored over his notes, piecing together the fragments of the Covenant. Celeste had uncovered the truth and tried to escape, but her flight had triggered the Pact's next phase, binding Isadora to Julian and leaving Elias entangled as a witness. He wondered if Isadora was a willing participant or a prisoner, her cryptic warnings a plea for help or a trap. Determined to confront her, Elias sought Isadora at the Haverford estate. The manor was eerily quiet, its halls dim despite the morning light. Isadora met him in the conservatory, her emerald eyes shadowed with fatigue. "You've been to the manor," she said, not a question but a statement. Elias nodded, producing the locket. Her face softened, and for the first time, she seemed vulnerable. "Celeste was my friend," she whispered. "She thought she could outrun them, but no one does." Isadora revealed a truth that chilled Elias to his core. She was not merely a vein by blood, but a vessel for the Covenant, chosen at birth to uphold the pact. Her marriage to Julian was a ritual, not a choice, sealing the debt for another generation. Celeste, by refusing her role, had awakened the Watchers, who now sought to restore balance by claiming those who interfered. "You've seen them," Isadora said, her voice trembling. "They're in the shadows, the mirrors, the wind. They'll come for you unless you stop." Elias demanded to know how to break the cycle. Isadora hesitated, then handed him a key, its surface etched with the same symbols. From the tome, "The altar beneath the Vane Manor," she said. "Destroy the veil, but know this, the Watchers will fight to protect it. And if you succeed, the debt may claim another price." She refused to say more, urging him to act before the next new moon, when the Pact's power would peak. That night, Elias returned to the Vane Manor, armed with the key, a vial of holy water from St. Eloin's chapel, and a resolve born of desperation. The cavern was colder now, the hum a deafening roar. The veil on the altar pulsed with a sickly light, and the air was thick with whispers, names, pleas, and warnings in voices that weren't human. As Elias approached, the shadows coalesced into forms, veiled figures with hollow eyes, their hands reaching for him. He splashed the holy water, and the figures recoiled, their wails echoing through the cavern. With trembling hands, Elias unlocked a stone panel beneath the altar, revealing a crystal embedded with a dark, swirling mist. The tome had called it the Heart of the Covenant, the anchor binding the Watchers to the world. He raised his dagger, but the air grew heavy, pinning him in place. A voice cold and ancient spoke from the veil. "You cannot undo what was woven. The debt must be paid." Images flooded his mind. Celeste running through the fog, Julian's anguished face, Isadora's tearful resignation. And then a vision of himself standing at the altar, a veil draped over his shoulders. In a surge of defiance, Elias drove the dagger into the crystal. A scream tore through the cavern, and the veil ignited, its flames cold and blue. The figures dissolved, and the hum ceased, leaving an oppressive silence. Elias staggered out, the manor collapsing behind him in a cascade of stone and dust. He returned to Eldermoor, exhausted but alive, the locket still clutched in his hand. In the weeks that followed, the town changed. Julian and Isadora vanished, leaving the Haverford estate empty. Celeste's paintings were found scattered across the cliffs, as if carried by the wind. Elias, haunted by what he'd seen, burned the tome and buried the locket, hoping to sever the last ties to the Covenant. But at night, he still heard whispers in the wind, and in his dreams, a veiled figure watched from the shadows, its eyes no longer hollow but familiar. His own. Eldermoor never spoke of the swapped bride again, but the story lived on in Elias's journal, a warning to those who might stumble upon the town's buried secrets. The Covenant was broken, or so he hoped, but the Watchers he feared were never truly gone.